I opened the heavy wooden door to my apartment after a very long, very exhausting day at work, and I found 6 of my husband's relatives settled in comfortably in my living room, just waiting for dinner. I did not yell. I did not scream. I smiled politely, walked straight to the master bedroom, and closed the door firmly behind me. I had absolutely no intention of cooking for anyone. I had already eaten on the way home. My name is Mabel. I am 34 years old, and until about 22 months ago, I had what most people in this world would describe as a really good, stable life. I work as a pediatric occupational therapist at a busy children's rehabilitation center. It is a demanding job, one that I trained 7 hard years to do. I genuinely loved my work. It is the specific, difficult, sustaining kind of love you only get from doing a job that actually matters in the world, a job where you help vulnerable people find their footing again. Let me tell you about the Tuesday in November that changed everything. I want you to picture this day, because I know so many of you have had days exactly like this one. I had endured a genuinely hard day at the clinic. One of my young patients, a sweet 6-year-old boy named Calder who has cerebral palsy, had suffered a severe physical setback. I had been working with Calder for 14 long months. We were making wonderful progress. He was learning to hold his utensils, to manage his own coat buttons. But this sudden setback required a massive adjustment to his entire treatment plan. That meant I had to sit down in a small, windowless office under buzzing fluorescent lights and have a very difficult, heartbreaking conversation with his parents. I watched their tired faces fall. I watched Calder's mother wipe her eyes with a crumpled tissue, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. We had to discuss the harsh realities of increased physical therapy sessions and the mounting medical bills. I could see his father staring blankly at the wall, clearly calculating numbers in his head, probably wondering how this unexpected financial burden would affect the college fund they had barely started putting together for Calder. Managing other people's pain, absorbing their deep distress, and doing it all professionally and competently takes a massive toll on your spirit. After 2 solid hours of filling out dense medical paperwork following that conversation, I was completely drained. My physical body felt like it was made of solid lead. I finally left the rehabilitation center at 15 minutes past 6 in the evening. The sky was already dark, a heavy, cold winter dark that sinks right into your bones. The wind was whipping dead leaves across the asphalt. I walked down to the small, brightly lit cafe on the ground floor of my office building. I stood in line behind 2 nurses and bought a simple tuna salad sandwich on wheat bread and a bottle of sparkling water. I walked out to the parking lot, got into my car, and turned the heater up as high as it would go. I sat right there in the driver's seat, my cold hands resting on the leather steering wheel, and I ate that sandwich in absolute silence. The parking lot was slowly emptying out around me. I did this because I knew, with the bone-deep certainty of a woman who has been in this exact situation enough times to develop survival instincts, that I should never, ever arrive home hungry. Hunger makes you weak, and I had a feeling I could not afford to be weak. I finished the sandwich. I wiped my mouth with a paper napkin. I put the car in gear and drove through the sluggish, red-lit evening traffic. I turned onto my quiet street. I parked in my assigned parking spot at the back of the building. I pulled my heavy tote bag over my shoulder and climbed the 3 flights of stairs to my floor. My legs ached with every step. The hallway smelled faintly of lemon floor wax and old carpets. I reached into my bag, found my keys, and put my key in the lock. I turned it. I pushed my front door open, fully expecting to be greeted by the quiet, familiar peace of my own home. Instead, the noise hit me like a physical blow to the chest. The living room sofa held my husband's older brother, Desmond, and Desmond's wife, Jolene. They looked completely relaxed, leaning back against the cushions as if they paid the mortgage. Sitting right in the center of the room, occupying my favorite armchair, was my husband's aunt, Francine. That was the armchair I had carried up those 3 flights of stairs all by myself when I first bought it. I had spent 2 entire weeks just choosing the specific blue upholstery fabric. 2 of Desmond and Jolene's children, 2 energetic boys aged 7 and 9, were sprawling all over the expensive wool rug in front of the television. The television was blaring a frantic cartoon at a volume I would never, ever have chosen for my own home. My husband's younger sister, Rowena, was casually leaning against the kitchen doorway, holding a bottle of beer in her hand, kicking her foot against the baseboard. And then there was my husband, Harlan. He was sitting on the smaller sofa near the window. He looked up at me the exact second I walked in. He wore an expression I had learned to read with absolute precision over our 2 years of marriage. It was the exact expression of a man who knows he has done something incredibly wrong, and he is betting every single dollar he has on your basic human decency not to make a scene in front of his family. He was relying on my good manners to save him from his own bad behavior. "Mabel," he said, standing up quickly, smoothing his hands down the front of his trousers. "You are home. Come in. Look who is here." I looked. I looked at all of them. I felt a hot flash crawl right up my neck, a tight sensation gripping my chest. My jaw clamped down so hard my teeth ached. But I smiled. The smile was completely automatic. It was the kind of smile that costs you nothing and means even less. It was a tool I used to protect myself. Aunt Francine rose heavily from my blue armchair to kiss my cheek. She smelled strongly of floral perfume and hairspray. I stood perfectly still and let her press her cheek against mine. Jolene waved lazily from the sofa and said something vague about just being in the neighborhood and deciding to drop by to see us. The 2 children on the rug did not even bother to look up from the bright television screen. Rowena just lifted her beer bottle toward me in a lazy greeting from the kitchen. While I stood there in the narrow entryway, my coat still on, my tote bag still digging into my shoulder, my nose caught a distinct scent coming from the kitchen. It was the heavy, unmistakable smell of onions and garlic frying in hot oil. Someone had started cooking. It was the beginning smell of a large, complicated meal, something heavy with meat and sauce that was going to take at least another full hour to finish. They were making themselves entirely at home in a kitchen that belonged to me, using my pots, my pans, and my groceries. "I am just going to go change my clothes," I said. My voice was perfectly pleasant. It was smooth and even. I did not let a single ounce of my exhaustion or my simmering anger bleed into my tone. I did not wait for a response from Harlan or anyone else. I walked straight down the hallway. I walked into the master bedroom. I closed the heavy wooden door behind me. I heard the metal latch click securely into place. The sound of that click felt incredibly satisfying. I did not turn on the main overhead light. I walked over and sat on the very edge of the bed in the half-darkness. I reached down and slowly took off my work shoes. I held them in my lap for a long moment. I just sat there, breathing in the quiet of the bedroom, while the loud, obnoxious cartoon noises and the booming laughter of Desmond bled right through the drywall. The smell of frying onions was growing stronger, seeping under the bottom gap of the bedroom door. I had eaten my sandwich. I was tired. I had spent the entire afternoon managing the emotional devastation of a family dealing with a sick child. I had spent my entire day being competent, being compassionate, and being exactly what other people needed me to be. I had nothing left in my emotional bank account. I had absolutely nothing left for the performance required of a woman who comes home to find 6 uninvited relatives permanently installed in her living room. A woman who is expected to act delighted, tie on an apron, and start serving drinks. I placed my shoes neatly by the wooden wardrobe. I stripped off my stiff work clothes, folding them deliberately. I changed into a pair of soft, loose gray sweatpants and an old, comfortable cotton shirt. I walked over to my nightstand. I opened the drawer and took out the mystery novel I was in the middle of reading. It was a thick book about a detective working in a rainy coastal town. I climbed into bed, propped my pillows up against the headboard, pulled the thick quilt over my legs, and I opened my book. I began to read. I focused all my attention on the black ink on the white paper. While my eyes scanned the words, my mind drifted away from the noise in the living room and back to the history of this apartment. The walls around me. I bought this place with my own money when I was 31 years old. I did not have a wealthy family to help me. I worked long hours, I saved my salary meticulously, penny by penny, month after month. I skipped vacations. I ate cheap meals. I looked at dozens of awful, cramped apartments with terrible landlords before I finally found this one. I bought this 2-bedroom apartment on a quiet, tree-lined street. There is a wonderful little bakery on one corner where an older man sells the most incredible sourdough bread and sweet pastries. There is a reliable pharmacy on the other corner. 3 blocks to the east, there is a large, beautiful public park where I used to go running on the mornings when I had the energy. This apartment has magnificent light. The large west-facing windows in the living room catch the sun as it goes down. In the late afternoon, the light turns the entire room a rich, warm amber color. I had furnished the place very slowly, very deliberately. When you are decorating a home alone, every single piece of furniture, every rug, every picture frame is chosen because you genuinely want it there. I painted the walls myself. I hung the curtains myself. It was my quiet sanctuary. It was the physical proof that I could take care of myself in this world. Then, 2.5 years ago, I met Harlan. We met at a birthday dinner for a mutual friend at a loud Italian restaurant downtown. I remember the tables had those classic red and white checkered tablecloths. He ordered the baked ziti. He was a civil engineer. He was tall, with broad shoulders, and he had a very considered way about him. He was the kind of man who actually stopped and thought before he spoke. He had a very dry, quiet sense of humor that only appeared gradually, like something he was slowly deciding he could trust you with. A few months into our relationship, he received a major promotion at his engineering firm, and we celebrated by opening a bottle of champagne on my small balcony. Everything felt so easy, so perfectly aligned. We dated for 8 wonderful months. Then, his apartment lease was coming to an end. My apartment was much larger, and it was closer to the city center. He suggested he move in with me. I agreed. I agreed with the warm, secure confidence of a woman who has waited a long time to find the right person and truly believes she has finally found him. We shared the daily living expenses, the utility bills, and the groceries, but the deed to the apartment and the mortgage remained solely in my name. I was in love, but I was not foolish. 13 months after he unpacked his boxes in my bedroom, we got married. It was a beautiful, small wedding. We only invited 60 guests. We held the ceremony in my aunt's garden in late September, right when the air was turning crisp and the leaves were starting to turn gold and red. When we stood under the wooden archway to say our vows, Harlan cried. Real tears rolled down his cheeks. I wiped them away with my thumb. I genuinely thought his tears meant something profound. I thought they meant he understood the weight of the promises we were making to each other to protect one another. I knew going into the marriage that his family was large. His parents lived about an hour away by car. He had 2 brothers and a sister, all married, all with children of their own. He had countless aunts, uncles, and cousins. He even had family friends who were around so often they functioned exactly like cousins. They operated as a massive, unified pack. They were the kind of family you see in movies or read about in big family sagas. Loud, constantly talking over one another, always physically present in the room. They moved in and out of each other's houses and lives with a casual, chaotic intimacy that belongs to people who have never, ever learned how to separate and be independent individuals. I had grown up so differently. I was the only child of 2 very quiet people. My parents loved each other deeply, but they kept their world very small and very private. Our evenings consisted of quiet dinners and reading books in the living room. Before my father ever came to visit me at my apartment, he would call 2 weeks in advance. He would ask if the dates worked for my schedule. He never demanded. He never assumed my door was always open. Initially, Harlan's family felt like a wonderful abundance. It felt like a warm, heavy blanket. All that noise, all those people hugging me tightly, welcoming me into the fold. At every single family gathering, someone was always pressing a plate of homemade casseroles or baked goods into my hands. I remember we went to a funeral for one of his great-uncles shortly after we got engaged. Even at the funeral reception in the gloomy church basement, the family was roaring with laughter, swapping wild stories, eating mountains of potato salad, completely taking over the space. I remember Aunt Francine arguing loudly with another relative about an old inheritance dispute right next to the dessert table. It was overwhelming, it was chaotic, but I thought it was just their unique version of love. What I did not understand then, what I only came to understand very slowly, incrementally, day by day, was the dark side of that overwhelming closeness. You know how you sit in a room, and you do not realize the temperature has dropped until you suddenly notice you have been sitting with your arms crossed tightly over your chest for a full hour, shivering? That is exactly how it happened. I slowly realized that welcoming me into their loud group and respecting the physical and emotional boundaries of my home were two entirely unrelated concepts to them. To them, my home was just another extension of their communal territory. The boundary crossing started small. The very first time his brother Desmond and Jolene came to stay at our apartment for a long weekend, Harlan casually informed me exactly 2 days before they arrived. I scrambled to buy extra groceries, wash the guest sheets, and clean the bathroom. The second time they came to stay, he told me one single day before. The third time, I did not get any warning at all. I simply drove home from the clinic, exhausted, and found Desmond's heavy blue truck parked right in my assigned parking spot. I had to park 2 streets away in the pouring rain and carry my heavy work bags all the way home. By the 4th visit, I stopped expecting any notice at all. I raised the issue with Harlan every single time it happened. I would sit him down at the kitchen table after the guests had finally left. I would speak calmly, specifically, and clearly. I used the exact same measured tone I used at work when explaining a complex treatment plan to parents. Later, a good friend of mine would tell me that I raised my concerns with far too much care and precision, and ultimately, with entirely insufficient force. Harlan would always apologize. He would reach across the table and hold my hand. He would look deeply into my eyes and say he would talk to them. He would say, "Mabel, you know how they are. They are just family. They do not think of it as imposing. They just love us." He would promise me, swearing up and down, that he would make sure it never happened again. And every single time, it happened again. And every single time, the invasion was slightly worse than the time before. That is exactly how these things progress when there are absolutely no real consequences for bad behavior. People push the line, and if you do not push back forcefully, they redraw the line closer to your throat. I want to be very specific about what slightly worse looked like in my daily life. The tendency when you describe this kind of slow accumulation of disrespect is that you end up sounding petty. You sound like a bitter, complaining woman cataloging tiny grievances that are far too small to justify the massive amount of anger they produce. So, let me give you the cold, hard specifics. One afternoon, Harlan's mother came over while I was at work. She had a key for emergencies. She decided to use my kitchen to bake several pies for a church bake sale. She did not ask my permission. When I came home, the kitchen was an absolute disaster zone. There was white flour dusted over the dark hardwood floor, sticky cherry fruit filling hardened onto the granite countertops, and a sink completely overflowing with greasy mixing bowls and measuring cups. She left it in a state I would never, ever dream of leaving a total stranger's kitchen, let alone my daughter-in-law's. I spent 2 hours scrubbing the counters that night while my husband watched television. Another time, Aunt Francine stayed over for a long weekend. I went into the master bathroom the next morning to get ready for work. I opened the medicine cabinet above the sink. Everything was completely rearranged. My prescription medicine bottles were shoved to the very back corner, my daily skincare was jumbled together in a pile, and Francine's heavy glass jars of anti-aging night cream were lined up perfectly in the front row. When I asked her about it gently, she patted my arm condescendingly and said, "Darling, you had it so cluttered in there. I just made more room for everyone." For 3 entire days, I could not find my own pain medication. Then there was the incident with the hallway wall. Desmond and Jolene brought their 2 boys over for a Sunday afternoon. I was in the kitchen trying to prepare a large salad for everyone. I walked out into the hallway to get a serving bowl from the dining room cabinet. I caught the 7-year-old pressing a blue ballpoint pen hard into the beige drywall, dragging it in long, chaotic scribbles right next to the white baseboard. I took a deep breath to steady myself. I walked over, gently took the pen out of his hand, and walked into the living room where Jolene was scrolling carelessly on her phone. I showed her the pen and calmly pointed out the bright blue ink all over the wall. Jolene barely looked up from her screen. She let out a loud, obnoxious laugh. "Oh, Mabel," she chuckled, waving her hand dismissively in the air. "Kids will be kids. A little soap and hot water will take that right off." She did not offer to clean it. She did not hand me a sponge. She did not discipline her son or tell him to apologize. Later that evening, after they finally packed up their car and left, Harlan came to me in the kitchen. He looked deeply uncomfortable. He reported, very carefully, that Jolene had pulled him aside before they drove away. Jolene had told Harlan that I had been acting cold and unwelcoming to her and the children all afternoon. Harlan relayed this information to me in the tone of a man who sincerely hopes she will take the cruel insult as constructive feedback. I felt a tight knot form in my stomach, a heavy weight of guilt that did not even belong to me. But I swallowed my pride. I took it as constructive. I told myself I was being too rigid, too demanding. I softened my manner. I drew my own boundaries smaller and smaller, making myself tiny so his massive family could fit comfortably inside my living space. I convinced myself that this is simply what marriage looks like when you marry into a big, tight-knit family. I told myself the deep discomfort I felt in my own home was my personal problem to manage, a flaw in my own personality that I needed to fix. I believed the terrible lie that true love requires endless adjustment, constant flexibility, and the absolute willingness to hold your own personal needs so loosely that they slip right through your fingers and disappear. None of that was true. Not a single word of it. But I believed it for long enough to let my beautiful apartment, the apartment with the amber afternoon light, the carefully chosen blue armchair, the quiet park 3 blocks away, become something I was merely hosting events in, rather than a place I was actually living in. I became the unpaid manager of a chaotic bed and breakfast that I was funding entirely with my own paycheck. I dreaded coming home. Sometimes I would sit in my car in the parking lot for 20 minutes, just staring at the steering wheel, gathering the courage to walk upstairs and face whoever might be sitting on my couch. And then came the Tuesday in November. The Tuesday with the 6 relatives lounging in the living room, completely ignoring my arrival, while heavy onions fried in my kitchen. I was lying in my bed, staring at the pages of my mystery novel. The words blurred together into meaningless black lines. I was not really reading. I was actively watching the digital clock on my nightstand. The red numbers flipped over, minute by minute. I was watching with a very specific, detached interest, measuring the exact limits of my own patience. I wanted to see exactly how long it would take for him to come looking for me. 14 minutes. It took exactly 14 minutes for the brass bedroom door handle to turn. Harlan pushed the door open and stepped inside. He carefully closed the door behind him, making sure it latched securely. He stood there at the foot of the bed. The bedroom was still mostly dark, illuminated only by the small, warm yellow reading lamp clipped to my book. "Hey," he said. His voice was low, tentative, probing the silence. I did not look up. I kept my eyes fixed on the paper. "Are you okay?" he asked. "Fine," I said. My voice was completely flat. I reached up and slowly turned a page. The stiff paper made a crisp rustling sound in the quiet room. He shifted his weight nervously from one foot to the other. "Are you coming out?" I finally stopped pretending to read. I lifted my head from the pillow and looked directly into his face. The shadows hid his eyes, but I could see the stiff tension in his shoulders. No, I said. Just one word. Cold and absolute. Mabel, he sighed heavily, dragging a hand through his hair. Please. I closed the book, but I kept my thumb firmly pressed between the pages to mark my spot. I rested the heavy book on my lap. When did you know they were coming over? I asked. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. The eerie calmness of my tone seemed to unnerve him far more than screaming would have. There was a heavy pause. I could hear the television blaring loudly through the wall. I could hear Desmond laughing heartily at something Jolene said. The smell of the food was getting stronger, thick and greasy. This afternoon, Harlan finally muttered, looking down at the toes of his shoes. I nodded slowly, letting the silence stretch out. This afternoon. So, you had several hours. You had hours during which you could have picked up your phone and called me at the clinic. You could have sent a text. He swallowed hard. I know. I should have. But you did not, I stated, staring right through him. And instead, you consciously decided to let me drive home, walk through my own front door, and find 6 people permanently installed in our living room at 6:30 in the evening. After I just finished a 10-hour shift dealing with a family medical crisis. I picked the book back up and opened it to my marked page. I have already eaten dinner. I am going to stay in here and read my book. You are more than welcome to get in bed and join me if you want quiet. Mabel, there are guests out there, he hissed, his voice finally taking on an edge of defensive frustration. There are your guests out there, I corrected him without missing a single beat. I did not invite a single one of them into this house. He stood there in the doorway for a long, agonizing moment. I could feel his physical presence hovering over me in the shadows. It was the exact posture of a man who desperately wants to start a screaming argument but suddenly realizes he cannot find a single logical point to argue with. He had no defense. He knew he was entirely in the wrong, and he hated that I was refusing to give him an emotional reaction he could use against me. He wanted me to be hysterical so he could call me crazy. I refused to give him that satisfaction. Finally, he let out a sharp, angry breath, turned around, walked out, and pulled the door shut behind him with a little more force than necessary. The frame rattled slightly. I listened to the latch click again. I listened as the muffled sounds of the living room briefly spiked in volume when he opened the door, and then settled back into their chaotic, booming rhythm when he closed it. I leaned back against my pillows. I read my book. I want to be perfectly clear with you ladies. This specific moment in the bedroom? This was not the big fight. This was not the explosive climax where the marriage finally broke open and shattered into a million pieces on the floor. This was simply a very tired woman, wearing comfortable sweatpants, reading a paperback novel in her own bed. The real fight was still coming. But what that Tuesday evening represented was a line. It was the very first boundary line I had drawn in 2 solid years without immediately walking back across it to apologize for my own feelings. Sitting there, turning the pages under the small yellow glow of my reading lamp, while unauthorized onions fried in my own kitchen, I felt a physical sensation in my chest. Something deep inside me was shifting. Great tectonic plates of my personality were grinding together and moving into a new position. I did not have the exact vocabulary for it yet, but I knew I was no longer the same woman who had walked out the door that morning. I was done shrinking. The relatives finally finished eating, watched more television, and left around 10 o'clock at night. I lay in bed and tracked their entire departure entirely by sound. I heard the loud scraping of heavy wooden chairs on the dining room floor. I heard Jolene loudly rounding up the children, her voice shrill and demanding as she searched for lost shoes. I heard the rustling of heavy winter coats being pulled out of the hall closet. I heard the loud, drawn-out chorus of goodbyes in the narrow entryway. I heard Harlan's voice, pitched low and falsely cheerful, thanking them profusely for coming over. I heard Aunt Francine shout a final, booming farewell that echoed in the stairwell. And then, I heard the heavy front door slam shut. Silence rushed back into the apartment, ringing loudly in my ears. A few minutes later, Harlan came back into the bedroom. I was still sitting up, the book still open in my lap. He did not say a word to me. He walked straight into the bathroom, brushed his teeth aggressively, changed into his pajamas, and came back out. He walked around to his side of the bed, pulled back the heavy quilt, and lay down beside me. He lay flat on his back, his hands folded over his stomach, staring straight up at the dark ceiling. For a long time, the only sound in the room was the steady ticking of the small clock on my nightstand. Neither of us spoke. The air between us felt thick, heavy, and completely unbreathable. Then, into the darkness, he spoke. "You were rude." I did not flinch. I did not turn my head to look at him. I simply reached up and turned another page of my book. The paper rustled loudly, breaking the silence. "I was tired," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "And I was hungry. And I was not told." He shifted aggressively under the covers, kicking his legs out. "They are family, Mabel." "So you keep saying," I replied evenly. Another long, suffocating silence stretched between us in the dark room. "Then what exactly did you want me to do?" he demanded, his voice rising, thick with defensive anger. "Did you want me to call them and tell them not to come? Tell my own aunt she is not welcome?" I finally closed the book and set it down heavily on the nightstand. I turned my head to look at his sharp profile in the shadows. "Yes," I said clearly. "Or, at the bare minimum, you could call me. Or ask me. Or acknowledge the simple fact that this is also my home, and I get a say in who is inside of it." I lay down on my side, facing away from him, and pulled the blanket up to my chin. "Pick any of those options, Harlan. Pick all of them." What I did not want was to walk into my own living room, after the day I had, and find a dinner party I knew absolutely nothing about already in progress. "You did not even try," he spat bitterly, turning his back to me so we were facing opposite walls. "You just walked away and hid in here like a child." "I had already eaten," I said. He reached out and snapped the reading lamp off without responding. The room plunged into total, suffocating darkness. I lay there in the blackness, my eyes wide open. My heart was beating steadily. I was not crying. I did not shed a single tear. I was thinking with absolute, chilling clarity. This is not about the food, I thought to myself. He knows it is not about the food. He knows it is not about me hiding in the bedroom. The very fact that he is pretending this entire argument is about me not eating dinner with his family is, in itself, a massive piece of information. He was trying to control the narrative. He was twisting the reality of the situation so that he could be the victim of a cold, unfeeling wife, rather than face the fact that he was a cowardly husband who refused to establish basic boundaries with his intrusive family. He needed me to be the villain so he would not have to face his own failure to protect our marriage. He was terrified of them, and he was taking it out on me. I took that piece of information, I filed it away in a very secure cabinet in my mind, I closed my eyes, and I went to sleep. The real battle was just beginning. The following 2 weeks were surface normal. That is the only way I can describe it. Harlan was slightly cooler, slightly careful in the way of a man who has firmly decided the entire situation was your fault, but is smart enough not to say it directly to your face. We moved around our apartment like two strangers sharing a waiting room. We woke up, we took turns in the bathroom, we made our coffee, and we went to work. I was pleasant. I was physically present. But I did not apologize. That was completely new for us. In the past, I would have caved by Wednesday. I would have made his favorite dinner, poured him a glass of wine, and apologized for overreacting. But this time I held my ground. I could actually feel him registering the total absence of my apology. He was waiting for a sound that simply never came. He would sit on the couch, watching television, and cast these quick, sideways glances at me, expecting me to crack. I did not crack. I sat in my blue armchair and read my books. His family texted him constantly. I noticed this not because I was snooping on his phone, but because his phone would buzz aggressively on the kitchen counter. He would go completely quiet for a few minutes while reading the screen, and then he would look up at me with that specific "bet on your decency" expression. He was communicating with them about me. I knew it in my bones. I found it incredibly tiring. Then, on a Thursday afternoon, Aunt Francine called me directly. I was sitting at my desk at the rehabilitation clinic. I had just finished a grueling physical therapy session with little Calder. His parents were still incredibly stressed about his medical bills and terrified they would have to drain the small college fund they had set up for him just to cover his basic care. I was exhausted. My phone buzzed on the desk. The caller ID flashed Francine's name. I stared at the screen for 5 seconds. I let it go straight to voicemail. I listened to the message later that day while sitting in my car in the clinic parking lot, eating a dry granola bar for lunch. I pressed play and held the phone to my ear. Francine's voice filled the small space of my car. She sounded incredibly worried. She said she could tell something was very wrong between Harlan and me. She said she absolutely did not want any hard feelings in the family. She said she sincerely hoped I understood that she and the rest of the family just wanted to be close to Harlan, and by extension, to me. She said that was simply how their family showed love, by always being together. Her voice was incredibly warm, but it was also slightly wounded. It was exactly equal parts warmth and wound. Sitting there in my car, I recognized that specific combination. It was a compound instrument played to produce a very specific result. She wanted me to feel guilty. She wanted me to call her back, apologize for being distant, and invite them all over for Sunday roast to make up for my terrible behavior. I sat there and thought, she is really good at this. Then I thought, she has had decades of practice. I did not call her back. I opened my text messages and typed a very short reply. Thank you for calling, Francine. All fine here. Take care. I hit send. I put the car in drive and went back to work. I left it exactly at that. That following Saturday morning, Harlan and I were sitting at the kitchen table drinking coffee. The winter sun was streaming through the windows, making the kitchen look deceptively cheerful. He cleared his throat loudly. My parents are thinking of visiting next weekend, he said. He framed the sentence very carefully. He set his coffee mug down on the wooden table. I wanted to give you plenty of notice this time. I looked at him over the rim of my mug. I thought about the specific phrase this time. Its clear implication was that the only problem we had before was a simple logistics issue. He genuinely believed the only issue was that he forgot to check the calendar. He completely ignored the fundamental dynamic. He ignored the total absence of consultation. He ignored the deeply ingrained expectation that my home was a public venue available on demand to whoever his family decided to send our way. Thank you for the notice, I said evenly. Are they staying here? Just for the weekend, he said quickly, offering a tight smile. They do not want to be any trouble. I thought about that phrase. They do not want to be any trouble. It is the exact phrase that is always deployed by people who are currently in the process of being tremendous trouble. I set my mug down next to his. I folded my hands on the table. Harlan, I would like us to talk about this. Actually talk about it. Not just your parents coming next weekend, but the entire pattern. I think we need to have a real, honest conversation about how we handle family visits in our marriage. He looked at me with the weary expression of a man who had been desperately hoping for a completely different sentence. He let out a long breath. Okay, he said, his voice entirely devoid of warmth. Let's talk. I want to give that 2-hour conversation its due. We sat at that kitchen table for 2 solid hours. I said everything I had been holding inside my chest for months. I spoke specifically. I did not hurl accusations. I did not call his family names. I spoke in the measured, careful cadences of a woman who had been trained professionally to communicate about very hard things with grieving parents. I told him that I loved his family. I told him that I valued our connection to them. But I also told him that I absolutely needed our home to be a place I could count on coming home to. I needed a sanctuary, not a public venue that might contain a random assortment of relatives on any given Tuesday evening. I am not asking you to cut anyone off, I said, looking right into his eyes. I am not asking you to change who your family is. They are loud and they are close, and that is fine for them. But I am asking for basic consultation. I am asking for advance notice. I am asking for the basic human courtesy of being treated as an equal partner and a co-owner of the space we share together. He listened to me. He really seemed to listen. He nodded in several places. He rubbed his chin. He said he understood where I was coming from. He said he knew his family could be overwhelming. He promised me he would do better. He reached across the wooden table and took my hand in his. His hand was warm. I looked at his hand resting over mine. I tried very hard to determine whether I actually believed him. I wanted to believe him. That is the honest truth. I wanted very much to believe him because the alternative was too painful to accept. The alternative was that the 2-hour conversation we had just had would produce the exact same outcome as all the previous conversations. And that was a conclusion I simply was not ready to sit with yet. So, I actively chose to believe him. I chose to believe him the same way you choose to believe a sunny weather forecast when you desperately need the day to be clear for a picnic. I believed him with effort, with desperate hope, and with a very small, practical voice in the back of my mind noting that I should probably pack a heavy umbrella anyway. His parents came the following weekend. They arrived on Friday evening. They were perfectly pleasant, as they always were when they were the only guests. I went to the grocery store, I bought a large roast, and I cooked a beautiful dinner on Saturday evening. We sat in the dining room, we drank wine, and we had a genuinely nice time. Harlan was warm. He was attentive. He was charming in the exact way he was when things were good between us. He helped me clear the plates. He loaded the dishwasher. I lay in bed that Saturday night and thought, maybe this is it. Maybe this is what clear communication actually produces. Maybe setting a firm boundary actually worked. On Sunday morning, I woke up at 7 o'clock. The apartment was mostly quiet. But then I heard the unmistakable sound of a third, completely unfamiliar voice coming from the kitchen. It was a man's voice. It was deep and booming. It was not his mother. It was not his father. I lay frozen under the quilt, straining my ears. After a moment, I recognized the voice. It belonged to Harlan's older cousin, Lorna. She lived about 30 minutes away in the suburbs. She had apparently called Harlan late the night before to say she was driving through our part of the city early Sunday morning to buy a used car. And Harlan had said, "Come over for breakfast." He had not mentioned a single word of this to me. He had not nudged me awake. He had not sent a text. He just invited her in. I lay flat on my back in my bed and listened to the three of them laughing and talking loudly in my kitchen. I heard the clatter of my coffee mugs. I heard the refrigerator door open and close. And I thought, very clearly and very calmly, there it is. I was not even angry yet. What I felt in my chest was much closer to profound sorrow. It was the specific, heavy sorrow of a desperate hope being finally confirmed as entirely unfounded. I had given my husband the clearest possible account of what I needed to feel safe and respected in my own home. He had looked me in the eye, he had held my hand, he had understood my words, and he had agreed to my terms. And then, the very first time an opportunity arose to actually practice that respect, he had reverted entirely to his prior pattern without apparently thinking about it for a single second. That meant one of two things. Either the 2-hour conversation we had at the kitchen table had genuinely not registered in his brain at all, which meant he was hopelessly thoughtless. Or, it had registered perfectly, and he had consciously decided that simply nodding and agreeing with me was sufficient, without requiring any actual, tangible change in his behavior. Both of those possibilities were incredibly bleak. One was painfully thoughtless. The other was malicious manipulation. I threw the quilt off my legs. I got out of bed. I put on my running clothes. I walked down the hallway and into the kitchen. Lorna was sitting at my kitchen island, drinking my expensive coffee out of my favorite mug. I said good morning to her. I smiled. Lorna is a perfectly nice person. She bore absolutely no responsibility for her cousin's terrible choices. She was just doing what her family always did. I walked past Harlan without making eye contact. I made myself a quick cup of coffee. I drank it standing by the sink. I excused myself politely, saying I needed to go for my morning run before the day got away from me. I walked down the 3 flights of stairs. I walked out into the crisp Sunday morning air. I jogged the 3 blocks east to the public park. I ran my usual route around the large lake. I ran for 45 solid minutes. The cold air burned my lungs, but it cleared my head. As my feet hit the pavement, I thought about what my life looked like from the outside. A nice apartment, a handsome engineer husband, a stable job, a big extended family. And then I thought about what my life actually felt like from the inside. It felt suffocating. It felt like a slow drowning. I realized just how incredibly wide the gap between those 2 views had become. When I finally got back to the apartment, sweaty and breathing hard, Lorna was gone. His parents were in the guest room getting dressed. Harlan was standing at the sink, washing the breakfast dishes. He turned around when he heard the door close. He looked at me. The bet on your decency expression was completely gone. It had been replaced by something much more apprehensive. He had the distinct look of a man who is slowly beginning to realize that the emotional bank account he has been drawing on so recklessly might actually be close to completely empty. I forgot to mention Lorna was coming by, he said quickly, wiping his hands on a dish towel. She just called late last night. I know, I said. My voice was steady. I was still standing in the entryway in my running clothes. My hair was pulled back tightly in a ponytail. My face was flushed from the freezing wind. It was just breakfast, Mabel, he added, trying to brush it off. Just coffee and toast. Harlan, I said. I dropped my keys into the bowl on the console table. I am going to go take a hot shower. When I come out of that bathroom, I would like us to sit down and talk. Not about Lorna specifically. I want to talk about what happens now. He frowned. The dish towel went still in his hands. What do you mean, what happens now? I looked at him squarely. I mean, I think we have a problem in this marriage that is much bigger than simple logistics. And I think we need to decide together right now whether we are going to solve it. Actually solve it. Not just discuss it for 2 hours and then immediately return to your default settings the very next morning. I turned and walked away. I went into the master bathroom. I turned the shower on as hot as I could stand it. I stood under the pounding water for 20 minutes. The steam filled the small room. While the hot water ran over my tired muscles, I thought about the very short list of options in front of me. I thought about which option I could actually live with for the rest of my natural life. And I thought about the word that had been slowly forming in the back of my mind for the past 3 months. It had been gathering mass, gathering weight. It was a word I had been circling constantly without ever letting myself actually land on it. The word was enough. The post-shower conversation, the one I had promised and the one he had been dreading while standing in the kitchen, happened at the exact same kitchen table. We sat in the same wooden chairs. We drank from the same ceramic mugs. We looked out the same large window at the quiet street below. But something about the physical quality of the light in the room was completely different that Sunday morning. The light felt harder. It felt less forgiving. Or perhaps the light was completely neutral, and I was simply different. Perhaps I had been projecting my own desperate warmth onto this cold apartment all along. I folded my hands on the table. I looked at my husband. I told him I needed him to understand something very clearly. I told him that I had perhaps not communicated my needs with sufficient, brutal directness in the past. I explained that the only reason I had softened my words was that I had been operating under the naive assumption that softening the sharp edges of a true thing made it easier for someone you love to accept it. What I have learned in this marriage, I said slowly, making sure he heard every syllable, is that softening the edges just makes the truth easier for you to ignore. He stared at me, his jaw tense. So, I am going to say it directly to you now, I continued. Your family treats our home exactly like a free hotel. I do not think they do it maliciously. I do not think they wake up wanting to cause me harm. But the effect on my life is exactly the same, regardless of their intent. I took a deep breath. I come home from a grueling job not knowing who will be sitting on my furniture. I never get consulted about guests. My space is invaded constantly. When I express even mild discomfort about this, your family describes me as a cold, unwelcoming woman. And when we sit down and discuss it privately, you agree with everything I say, you hold my hand, and then absolutely nothing changes. I picked up my coffee mug and held it tightly in both hands to stop them from shaking. That is not a scheduling problem, Harlan. That is a priorities problem. And the priority that is consistently losing in this marriage is me. Harlan was quiet for a very long time. It was not a thoughtful quiet. It was the deeply defensive silence of a man who is frantically sorting through his mental catalog of available responses, desperately looking for one that might defuse the bomb without conceding a single inch of territory. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms over his chest. My family is important to me, Mabel. I know that. I know that too, I said. They have always been exactly like this. It is how they operate. Exactly, he said, jumping on my words. That is just how they are. My question for you, I said, leaning forward slightly, is whether how they are is actually compatible with what I need to survive. My question is whether this pattern is something you genuinely want to work on fixing with me, or whether it is something you have firmly decided is simply fixed in stone. Have you decided that this is just how your family operates, and I simply need to adjust my entire life to accommodate them? He looked at me. His eyes were hard. I do not think it is fair of you to make me choose between my wife and my family. I am not asking you to choose between me and your family, I corrected him immediately. I am asking you to choose between two very different versions of our marriage. I held up one finger. Version 1, I am a full, equal partner in this home. My needs carry the exact same weight as yours. My space is respected. I held up a second finger. Version 2, I am forced to manage my entire life around your family's endless, unrestricted access to my physical space indefinitely, and I am expected to plaster on a smile and pretend it is totally fine. I set my hands flat on the table. Those are the only two options left on the table, Harlan. I would like to know right now which one you are choosing. The silence that followed that question was much longer than the first one. It felt like an eternity. Outside the window, a large city bus rumbled past, making the floorboards vibrate slightly. Somewhere down the street, someone's dog barked twice and then stopped abruptly. Harlan looked down at the wooden table. I looked steadily at Harlan. I felt a strange, cold clarity wash over me. It was a feeling that was almost peaceful. I knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that I was about to find out something I had not known for absolute certain until this exact moment. He finally raised his head. He looked me right in the eyes. I do not think you are being reasonable, he said. There it was. He did not say, I hear your pain and I want to do better. He did not say, you are right, I have been taking your generosity for granted. It was not even a clumsy attempt at a negotiation. He did not offer a counter-proposal. He did not try to meet me anywhere near the middle. He just said, "I do not think you are being reasonable." That sentence was not a response to the very real problems I had laid out. It was a final, damning verdict on the character of the woman who had spoken them. He was calling me crazy. "Okay," I said. My voice was quieter than a whisper. "Okay," he repeated, looking slightly confused by my lack of anger. "I needed to know exactly where you stood," I said, pushing my chair back and standing up. "Now I do." I picked up my mug, walked to the sink, and rinsed it out. I did not slam it. I set it gently in the drying rack. I walked down the hall to the bedroom. I closed the door. I picked up my cell phone from the nightstand and I called my best friend, Bernadette. Bernadette had been hearing my detailed version of this ongoing disaster in installments for the past 8 months. She answered her phone on the second ring. She answered with the specific, sharp alertness of a fiercely loyal woman who has been waiting for this exact phone call for a very long time. "Tell me," she commanded immediately. And I did. I paced the length of my bedroom and told her everything. I told her about the Tuesday night invasion. I told her about the 2-hour conversation. I told her about Lorna showing up for breakfast. And I told her Harlan's final verdict. Bernadette lived in a small house across town. She had a spare bedroom. She offered it to me before I had even finished the second paragraph of my story. She offered it in the decisive, no-nonsense way of a woman who has watched a friend she loves diminish gradually over time, and has been actively preparing her rescue response. "Pack a bag," Bernadette said fiercely. "I am coming to get you right now." "No," I said, stopping my pacing. I sat down on the edge of the bed. "I appreciate it, Bernie. I really do. But I am not ready to move out today. I need a few days to think clearly. I am not going to make massive, life-altering decisions in the hot, emotional wash of a terrible Sunday morning conversation." She sighed heavily into the phone. "Fine. You are always so practical. But hear me clearly, Mabel. The offer stands. It is an open invitation, and it does not expire. Call me the second you want out." What I did instead of packing a bag and running away immediately was something I had learned in my professional life. After 3 years of working with traumatized children and families who were constantly navigating the chaotic foster system or fighting over custody of medical decisions, I had learned a vital skill. I documented. I did not do it aggressively. I did not do it with malice or hostility. I just did it very, very carefully. I pulled a small blue notebook out of my desk drawer. I sat on the bed and I wrote down the exact dates and the specific details of the last 6 months of uninvited family visits. I wrote down the names of the people who came. I wrote down the damage done to the apartment. I noted the exact date of the 2-hour conversation Harlan and I had about the pattern. I noted the Lorna breakfast incident the very next morning. And finally, I wrote down the exact sentence Harlan had said to me that Sunday at the table. "I do not think you are being reasonable." I closed the notebook and zipped it safely into the inside pocket of my work tote bag. Later that same evening, after Harlan's parents had finally packed their bags and driven home, I called my father. My father is a very different man from Harlan. Unlike Harlan's chaotic family, my father always called me before he visited. Usually, he called 2 full weeks in advance. He always framed his visits as a polite question, asking if I was busy, rather than a demanding announcement. He was a retired accountant. He had a very quiet, methodical manner and a brilliant talent for identifying the hidden structural problem beneath any messy surface problem. When I told my father what was happening in my marriage, I told him the full, unvarnished version. I did not soften the edges to protect Harlan. My father listened to the entire story in complete silence. He did not interrupt me once. When I finally finished speaking, there was a long pause on the line. I could picture him sitting in his leather recliner, pushing his glasses up his nose. Then he spoke. His voice was calm, deep, and steady. "The apartment is yours," he said. It was not a question. It was a firm confirmation of fact. Yes, I said. You bought it completely before the marriage? He asked, his accountant brain shifting into gear. Yes, I confirmed. And the mortgage is in your name only? Yes, I said. We have been splitting the daily living costs, the groceries, and the utility bills since he moved in here. But the actual deed to the property and the bank mortgage are entirely mine. I pay the mortgage from my own salary every month. Good, my father said quietly. Practically. The word landed through the phone speaker like a heavy brass weight being set firmly on a glass table. Keep that fact in the front of your mind, Mabel. Do not let him confuse you. I promised him I would. The week that followed that Sunday conversation had a strange, overvivid quality. It was the specific kind of surreal clarity that coats the days you know are going to matter for the rest of your life. Harlan and I moved around each other in the apartment with the careful, exaggerated politeness of two people who have finally said real, terrible things out loud and are simply waiting in the trenches to see what those real things produce. He did not bring up Sunday's conversation again. He did not offer an apology. He was not outright unkind to me, he was just absent. He retreated fully into his daily routines as a form of emotional defense. He did his share of the dishes, he watched his engineering documentaries on the television, he went to his office, he came home. He desperately kept every interaction to the shallowest possible register of daily life, where absolutely nothing important could be said, debated, or decided. I went to the clinic. I saw my young patients. I celebrated small victories with Calder when he managed to button his own shirt. I came home. I made dinner. I ate it in silence. I cleaned the kitchen. And every single evening, sitting alone at the kitchen table while the amber light faded from the west-facing windows, I asked myself a question. How long can I do this? I did not ask it as a dramatic, theatrical question. I asked it genuinely. Practically. I looked around my beautiful home and wondered, how long can I maintain this hollow, silent version of my life before it costs me a piece of my soul that I can never get back? On Thursday afternoon, Aunt Francine called me again. This time, I was sitting in my office doing paperwork. I stared at the phone. I decided to answer it. I picked up the receiver. Hello, Francine, I said. Mabel, she said. Her voice was warm, but it was immediately purposeful. She was on a mission. I have been thinking about you so much, darling. Are you and Harlan doing all right? We are navigating some things right now, I said smoothly. It was a perfectly true statement that revealed absolutely nothing she could use against me. I spoke to him, she said, dropping the bomb casually. Something deep inside my chest went tight and cold. He is very hurt, you know, Francine continued, her voice dripping with manufactured sympathy. He feels like you have been actively pulling away from the family. He feels like you just do not want us around your apartment anymore. I held the phone tightly to my ear. I closed my eyes and focused on taking a slow, deep breath. Francine, I said, keeping my voice dangerously level. What exactly did Harlan tell you? Did he just vaguely say that things have been difficult lately? Did he say that you felt I was unhappy about family visits? Or did he happen to tell you that he and I sat down for 2 hours last Sunday and had a very serious conversation about what I need from our marriage to feel respected? There was a slight, telling pause on the other end of the line. She was recalibrating. He mentioned there had been some tension, she hedged. Did he tell you what I actually said during that conversation? I pressed. Another pause. Longer this time. He said you felt the family visited too much. I see, I said. Well, let me clarify. I told my husband, very calmly, that I needed to be consulted before any guests came to our private home. I told him I needed to be treated as an equal partner in this marriage, not a hotel maid. Those are the specific things I said to him. I let the silence hang for a moment so she could digest it. The fact that Harlan summarized all of that as me simply not wanting the family around is, in itself, highly informative, don't you think? I asked. Francine was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, she used a slightly different tone. It was still wearing the costume of warmth, but there was something hard and unyielding underneath it. It was a note of matriarchal authority that her previous warmth had been covering, the way a cheap tablecloth covers an unfinished, splintered table. Mabel, she said firmly. You married into a family. You knew we were close. That means making adjustments. Yes, I agreed immediately. It absolutely means adjustments. Adjustments from everyone involved. Including me, which I have been making constantly for 2 years. And including Harlan, which he has entirely refused to make. He loves you very much, she said, trying to appeal to my emotions. I believe that he thinks he does, I replied. But love and basic accountability are not mutually exclusive concepts. She sighed dramatically. You know, Mabel, it would really mean a great deal to all of us if you came to the large family dinner we are hosting at Desmond's house this Saturday evening. It might help smooth things over between everyone. I noticed her specific choice of the word smooth. The way it heavily implied that the surface appearance was the only thing that needed work, not the rotting structure beneath it. She wanted me to show up, smile, eat casserole, and pretend the house wasn't on fire. I will think about it, I said politely. Thank you for calling, Francine. I hung up the phone. I sat for a long moment in my quiet office. The afternoon light was fading outside the small window. I thought about the sequence of events. Harlan had called his aunt before he had talked to me again. He went running to his extended family with our private marital conflict before he ever came back to me with an apology or a solution. That meant that whatever emotional sorting he was doing in his private internal life, he was sorting it in their direction, seeking their validation, not mine. He was triangulating. It is a classic manipulation tactic. He was actively bringing his massive family into our private marriage to manage a conflict that only existed within our marriage. He did this because managing a conflict with his family present, where they outnumbered me and he had backup, was something he knew exactly how to do. Managing a conflict alone, face to face with an angry wife, was something he was apparently entirely incapable of doing. I drove home from the clinic that night and I did not stop at the cafe for a sandwich. I was not hungry. The adrenaline was keeping me full. I pulled into my parking spot at the back of my building. I turned the car off. I did not get out. I sat in the dark parking lot for 15 minutes, staring up at the lit windows on the 3rd floor. My windows. They glowed amber and warm in the freezing night. I sat there and thought about the life going on the other side of those glass panes. I asked myself if that was still the life I had planned to live. Inside, Harlan was in the kitchen making dinner. He had boiled a pot of pasta, my preferred kind, and made a simple red sauce. He had even set the table. There was a glass of chilled white wine poured and waiting at my place setting. He looked up when I walked in, carrying my heavy bag. He wore an expression that was desperately attempting warmth, but it was running slightly thin at the edges, like cheap paint applied over a greasy surface it wasn't quite sticking to. Francine called me, he said, before I even had my coat off. She said you two talked. We did, I said. I walked into the bedroom, put my bag on the chair, and hung my heavy coat in the closet. I walked back into the kitchen. She thought the big Saturday dinner at Desmond's might be a really good idea, Harlan said, gesturing toward the table. A chance for us to just relax and... Harlan, I interrupted him. My voice was sharp enough to cut glass. I pulled out my chair and sat down at the table. I looked directly at him. Did you call your aunt and tell her about our private conversation before you ever bothered to speak to me again about it? I asked. He stood holding a wooden spoon. He went completely quiet. He looked like a deer caught in the headlights. I am asking because I want to make sure I understand the exact sequence of events here, I said, leaning forward. On Sunday morning, we sit right here and have a serious conversation where I tell you my needs. You look at me and tell me I am being unreasonable. Monday through Thursday, you give me the silent treatment, but apparently, you speak to your Aunt Francine about our marriage. Then, on Thursday afternoon, she calls me at my place of work to suggest I come to a family dinner to smooth things over. I looked at him steadily. He could not meet my gaze. At what exact point in that incredibly cowardly sequence did you plan to come back and talk to your wife? I demanded. His jaw tightened visibly. A muscle ticked in his cheek. I was thinking about it. I was trying to process what you said. You were not processing it, I countered instantly. You were managing it. You were managing it with your family, which is exactly what you always do. When things get difficult, you don't bring the problem to me, your partner. You bring it to them. And then they come to me with a prepackaged solution that conveniently involves me just being more available to them and dropping my complaints. I reached out and picked up the wine glass by the stem. I held it up to the light. That is not a marriage, Harlan, I said quietly. That is a family system that I just happen to be living inside of as a minor character. He slowly set the wooden spoon down on the counter. He walked over and sat down in the chair opposite me. He just looked at me. And what I saw in his face in that specific moment was not the manipulative bet on your decency expression. It was not the apprehensive look. What I saw in his eyes was something completely raw, stripped of all defenses. And I want to be entirely fair to the man I married. I think that specific moment was genuine. I think he looked across the table at me and saw, perhaps for the very first time in his entire life, the massive, gaping canyon between what he had been offering me and what I actually needed to survive. He saw the sheer length of time that canyon had been wide open, swallowing my happiness. And for one single heartbeat, just a moment, I actually thought he might say the thing that could have changed the entire direction we were moving in. I thought he might finally wake up. He opened his mouth. He looked at my face. He said, I don't know how to make you happy. I slowly lowered the wine glass to the table. I know, I whispered. And I swear to you, that was the absolute saddest sentence I spoke in the entire conversation. It was the saddest because it was true. It was not a bitter accusation. It was a clinical diagnosis. I understood in that exact moment, staring at his defeated posture, that not knowing how to make me happy and not being willing to try to learn how were, for Harlan, functionally the exact same thing. He lacked the courage to try. If you've made it this far, please do me a favor, like the video and comment number 1 down below. It lets me know how awesome you are and shows that you're right here with me on this journey. Your support is a massive encouragement and truly motivates me. Drop that one so I can recognize you, and now, let's get back to my story. I ate the pasta he made. It was actually quite good. I politely told him so. We cleaned the kitchen together in heavy silence. We went into the living room and watched a mindless documentary on television. I went to bed early. He came to bed much later. We lay in the dark side by side, like two exhausted people who have completely run out of sentences to say to each other. That silence was its own kind of final answer. The big family dinner at Desmond's house was on Saturday. I did not go. I stood in the kitchen on Friday evening and told Harlan that I was going to pass on the dinner. I told him I had some personal errands I needed to take care of, and I sincerely hoped he had a good time with his family. He looked at me for a very long moment. He searched my face for any sign of a bluff. Finding none, he nodded once. It was the slow, defeated nod of a man who knows he has entirely lost the war but simply is not ready to sign the surrender papers out loud. He went to the dinner without me. I heard him leave the apartment at 6:15 on Saturday. The heavy door clicked shut. I stood in the middle of the living room and listened to the silence roll in. I sat in the quiet apartment and physically felt the specific piece of a space that was, for a few precious hours, entirely mine. I picked up my phone and called Bernadette. We talked for an hour about nothing important, just enjoying the sound of a friend's voice. I called my father. We talked about the weather and his garden. Then, I went into the kitchen and made myself a cup of chamomile tea. I walked back into the living room and sat in the blue armchair. The armchair I had carried up 3 flights of stairs. I looked at the amber sunlight streaming through the west-facing windows. That light had absolutely no loyalty to anyone. It did not care about family drama. It was simply itself, warm and beautiful. Sitting there in the quiet, I finally let myself think the massive thought I had been circling like a shark for weeks. I wanted him to leave. I did not want him to leave out of burning hatred. I did not want him to leave out of a petty desire for revenge or the sick satisfaction of punishing him. I did not hate Harlan. I wanted him to leave because I was a 34-year-old woman, and I had built a very good life for myself that I was actually good at living. Somewhere in the course of a marriage that had initially seemed like a wonderful abundance, it had turned out to be a slow, agonizing process of dispossession. I had lost the particular quality of ease, the deep breath of relief I used to have in this exact apartment before he moved his boxes in. And I desperately wanted it back. I wanted to come home to a physical space that was entirely mine and know, with absolute certainty, that it would still be mine when I unlocked the door. I wanted to make a cup of coffee on a Sunday morning without having to do complex mental math about who else might be sleeping in the guest room or sitting at the island. I wanted my dish cabinet, my bathroom sink, my blue armchair, and my west-facing windows to be simple again. I wanted them to be just what they were, and not the subject of an endless, exhausting negotiation. I wanted my life back. And sitting there in the perfectly quiet apartment on a Saturday evening, sipping my tea while my husband ate casseroles with the family that had slowly eaten my sanity, I finally understood that simply wanting my life back was not enough. I was going to have to do something terrifying about it. I made a phone call on Monday morning from my car during my lunch break. My father had given me a name. My father always has a name for every situation because he has spent his entire life in the quiet, thorough way of cautious accountants, collecting vital information just in case it ever becomes useful. I called the number. I explained my situation briefly to the receptionist. I was given an appointment for Wednesday afternoon. Her name was Opal. She was a family law attorney. I sat across from her massive wooden desk. Opal was a woman in her late 50s, wearing a sharp navy suit. She had the precise, unsentimental manner of someone who deals exclusively in hard facts rather than messy feelings, and respects you enough not to pretend the facts are comfortable. I brought the manila folder of documents I had carefully assembled over the weekend. I pulled out the original deed to the apartment, clearly showing my name alone. I pulled out the mortgage papers from the bank. I pulled out the detailed spreadsheet of shared household expenses I had been meticulously keeping for the past 2 years without entirely knowing why I was doing it. Opal put on her reading glasses. She went through every single page efficiently, making small check marks with a silver pen. When she finished, she took off her glasses, folded her hands on the desk, and looked up at me. "You have been very thorough," she said. "I have been very careful," I replied softly. She nodded sharply, as though those 2 words meant exactly the same thing in her office. She leaned back in her leather chair and began to explain my legal position. Because I had purchased the property before the marriage, using my own salary and savings, and because the deed and mortgage were solely in my name, the apartment was mine legally and unambiguously. It was documented in every relevant way. Opal asked if any part of the down payment had come from a family inheritance or joint funds. I assured her it had not, it was purely my own earned money. Therefore, Harlan had absolutely no legal claim to the property. Our financial entanglement was strictly limited to the shared checking accounts we had opened for joint groceries and utility expenses. Opal explained that those accounts would need to be divided fairly, but they contained no significant assets that either of us would realistically dispute. Furthermore, since we had no children together, we did not have to navigate the agonizing nightmare of a custody battle. The situation was, in strict legal terms, entirely clean. Opal explained the divorce process in our state. What it would not be, she warned me, was easy, fast, or emotionally comfortable. "Are you absolutely certain about this, Mabel?" Opal asked, looking at me intently before she printed any official paperwork. "Divorce is a heavy door to walk through." "I have been certain for 3 weeks," I said, my voice steady. "I have just been waiting to make sure the certainty was real, and not just a reactive emotional spike." She nodded again, a look of professional respect crossing her face. "Very well. Then let's talk about what you need to do next." What came next began on Friday evening. Harlan came home from his engineering firm at 6:30. He walked through the front door, dropped his keys in the bowl, and walked into the kitchen. I was sitting at the kitchen table. I was not cooking. That was the very first thing his brain registered. The complete absence of dinner. The cold, dark stove. And me, sitting perfectly still at the table with my hands wrapped around a cup of tea, staring at a thick manila folder resting on the surface in front of me. He stopped dead in his tracks. He looked at the folder. Then he looked up at my face. Something in his posture immediately shifted. It was the subtle way a person's physical body braces for an impact before the conscious mind fully processes the danger it is looking at. "Sit down," I said. My tone was not unkind. It was not angry. It was just impossibly direct. He pulled out the chair opposite me and sat down slowly. He did not take off his coat. I looked at him, the man I had married in a garden full of autumn leaves. I took a breath. And I told him exactly what I had decided. I told him that I had spent the last 6 months desperately trying to have a conversation that would produce a different, better outcome for us. I told him that despite my best efforts, the conversation had produced the exact same miserable outcome every single time. And I told him that I finally understood now that this was not a simple failure of communication on my part, but a glaring reflection of our actual, fundamental incompatibility. I told him that I was filing for divorce. And I told him that I wanted him to pack his things and move out of the apartment. I kept my voice incredibly steady. I told him the apartment was legally mine, and had always been mine. I told him I had spoken to a lawyer named Opal, that the legal process was straightforward, and that I deeply wanted to handle the entire separation with dignity and as little collateral damage as possible. He sat there and listened. He was very, very still. When I finally finished speaking, he said absolutely nothing for a long, agonizing moment. He just stared at the folder on the table. And then, he finally raised his eyes to mine. "Is this because of my family?" he asked softly. I thought about how to answer that question accurately. "It is because of us," I said finally. "Your family is simply the place where the fatal flaw in us became totally visible. The problem is not your Aunt Francine, or your brother Desmond, or your cousin Lorna. They are just being who they are." I leaned forward slightly. "The actual problem, Harlan, is that I have been telling you exactly what I need to feel safe and respected for months. And you have consistently, repeatedly chosen not to hear it. Not because you are a fundamentally bad person. You aren't. You chose not to hear it because truly hearing it would have required you to stand up and do something incredibly difficult. And doing something difficult where your family is concerned is something you are simply not capable of doing. You are terrified of their disapproval." I looked right into his eyes. "And I cannot build a secure life with a partner who is not able to do hard things to protect me." His face crumbled slightly. "You could have tried harder, Mabel. We could have tried counseling." "I tried for 6 months, I replied firmly. I tried with clear conversations. I tried with endless patience. I tried with constantly adjusting my own boundaries. I tried giving you the benefit of the doubt long after the doubt had completely run out. I am done trying to row a boat in a direction that simply doesn't go anywhere." I paused, letting the finality of it settle over the room. I do not want to fight with you about this tonight. I am not yelling. I am not angry anymore. I am just finished. He looked at me for a very long time. His face was doing several complicated things at once. I saw genuine grief. I saw flashes of anger. And I saw the specific, deeply wounded pride of a man who has just been told a devastating truth that he absolutely cannot argue against. Then, he stood up. He pushed his chair back slowly. He turned around and walked down the hallway to the master bedroom. I sat alone at the kitchen table. My tea had gone completely cold. I sat there and listened to the sounds echoing from the bedroom. I heard the heavy wooden doors of the wardrobe sliding open. I heard the zip of a canvas duffel bag. I listened to my husband pack his life into bags. He left the apartment that same night. He said he was going to stay on his brother Desmond's couch. When he stood at the front door, holding his bags, he turned back to look at me. He leaned in and kissed my forehead. It surprised me. His lips were cold. "I am sorry I wasn't better for you," he whispered. I looked at him, standing in the doorway of the life we were supposed to share. And I thought, me too. I genuinely, deeply thought, me too. The weeks that followed his departure had a very strange, suspended quality to them. The apartment was sad, yes. It was incredibly quiet. But running underneath that sadness, like a strong, hidden underground river, was something else. It was something that kept bubbling up to the surface when I wasn't actively guarding against it. It was profound relief. It usually arrived in the early mornings first. I would wake up in the large bed, and the apartment would be completely still. The pale winter light would come through the west-facing windows in its familiar amber way. And I would lie there under the quilt for a moment, staring at the ceiling, and know with the clean, sharp certainty of something fully restored that absolutely nobody was going to come walking through my front door today without my prior knowledge. I knew that the kitchen was mine. The bathroom cabinet, with my ibuprofen exactly where I left it, was mine. The blue armchair was mine. The clean linen closet was mine. The quiet, lazy Saturday mornings were entirely mine again. It felt like a small thing, but only in the exact way that drawing breath into your lungs is a small thing. It is entirely unremarkable when it is present, but its absence feels like the end of the whole world. Aunt Francine called me, exactly as I knew she would. She called 3 different times in the first 2 weeks after Harlan moved out. I let the first 2 calls go to voicemail. On the 3rd call, I finally answered. She sounded terribly upset. And this time it was not entirely performed. There was real, ragged distress in her voice. It was the deep distress of an older woman who had just watched a family unit she loved contract and fracture around a conflict she knew she had actively contributed to creating. I let her speak. I did not interrupt her. When she finally ran out of words and started crying softly, I spoke. "Francine," I said gently. "I want you to know right now that I hold absolutely nothing against you personally. But I need you to understand that what happened between Harlan and me was not about a single dinner party. It was not about one unexpected visit. It was about a massive, structural pattern of disrespect that Harlan and I simply could not resolve together as a couple. That failure is entirely between him and me. Please do not take our divorce as a statement about your worth." She was quiet for a long moment, sniffing into the phone. Then, with a quietness that I truly believe was genuine, she spoke. "I think we did ask too much of you, Mabel," she whispered. It cost her a great deal of pride to say that sentence out loud. I could hear the effort in her voice. "Thank you, Francine," I said sincerely. "I appreciate you saying that. We have not spoken a single word to each other since that day. And honestly, that is probably exactly what is needed for everyone right now. Harlan and I reached our final legal resolution in 8 weeks, exactly as Opal had predicted. He did not fight me for money. He was not unreasonable about dividing the checking accounts. That surprised me in a good way. It made me think that the decent version of him I had originally fallen in love with was not entirely fictional, it was just deeply insufficient for the kind of life I actually needed to lead. He took what was legally his, and I kept what was legally mine. We signed the final divorce papers on a cold Wednesday morning in Opal's downtown office. We sat at the big conference table. We used the silver pens. When it was done, we walked out into the freezing street together. We stood on the sidewalk for a moment, the wind whipping around us. We nodded at each other, and then we turned and walked away, going in completely different directions down the avenue. That, too, is its own kind of final answer. My father came to visit me on the second weekend of March. The winter snow was finally starting to melt. He drove 4 hours from his house. He arrived exactly at noon, as promised. He parked in the correct visitor parking spot because I had explicitly texted him which one was free. And he walked up the stairs and knocked on my front door, instead of using a key, because I had not yet given him one. When I opened the door, he stood there in his heavy coat. He looked at me for a long, silent moment. He was taking inventory in the specific way he always does, measuring with his eyes whether the physical person standing in front of him actually matches the tone of the voice he has been hearing on the phone calls. He smiled slightly. "You look well, Mabel." "I am," I said, realizing with a jolt that it was completely true. "Surprisingly." "Not surprisingly," my father corrected me gently, and he stepped inside. We cooked dinner together that afternoon, exactly the way we used to when I was a teenager growing up in his house. He handled all the precise chopping that required a sharp knife, and I handled the sauces and spices that required intuition. We moved around each other in my kitchen with the easy, quiet efficiency of two people who have been doing this dance together for decades. After dinner, he got his toolbox from the trunk of his car and replaced a squeaky hinge on the kitchen cabinet that had been driving me crazy for months. While he worked, he asked me about my patients. I told him about little Calder. I told him that Calder had finally had a major breakthrough in therapy the week before, a breakthrough so wonderful that it had made his exhausted mother cry tears of joy right there in my office. My father stopped turning the screwdriver and listened to my story with the full, undivided attention he has always given to the things I care about. When we finally sat down at the table to eat our meal, he looked around the apartment. He looked at the amber light hitting the walls. He looked at the blue armchair in the corner. He looked at a large painting of a coastal town that I had finally taken out of the closet and rehung on the wall exactly where I wanted it. "It looks like you," my father said softly, taking a sip of water. "It does now," I replied. He nodded once. It was the firm nod of a practical man who understands perfectly that some statements are so complete they simply do not require any further elaboration. It has been 4 full months since Harlan packed his bags and moved out. That is long enough for the dust to settle. It is long enough for my life to have finally settled into a new, solid shape. It is long enough for this existence to actually feel like it is mine, rather than feeling like some temporary, fragile arrangement I am just borrowing until something more permanent comes along. My mornings are beautifully quiet. My evenings are entirely mine to plan. I have invited Bernadette over for dinner twice. I have invited my colleague from the clinic over once for drinks. And I have my father over every other weekend. And every single time someone walks through my front door, it is because I have actively chosen it. It is because I have looked at my schedule, checked my own energy levels, and said yes. Because the invitation was entirely mine to give, and mine to withhold. I am not without sadness. I want to be brutally honest with you about that. Because the fairy tale story of the strong woman who reclaims her life, throws the bum out, and immediately finds that absolutely everything is better, simpler, and freer the very next day is not entirely the true story I am living. Healing is messy. I miss certain things. Not many things, but some. Sometimes, on a rainy Sunday morning, I miss the simple sound of another human being moving around in the apartment. I miss the incredible ease of early love, back before it revealed its harsh limitations. I mourn the theoretical version of Harlan, the version of the man he could have been in a completely different life, if he hadn't been so weighed down by his family's demands. I mourn those theoretical things at odd, unexpected moments while I am washing dishes or folding laundry. I mourn them with a feeling that is not quite crushing grief, and not quite bitter regret, but it lives somewhere in the quiet neighborhood bordering both. But let me tell you what I absolutely do not mourn. I do not mourn finding 6 relatives permanently camped out on my couch. I do not mourn finding my medicine cabinet rearranged. I do not mourn setting out 3 extra mugs by automatic reflex just in case someone drops by. And most importantly, I do not mourn that fake, polite smile. The smile that cost nothing and meant absolutely nothing. The smile I wore like a heavy plastic shield to survive my own living room. I have not worn that specific smile a single time since the day he left. I went for a long run last Saturday morning. I ran to the public park 3 blocks east of my building. The park I have known and loved since before Harlan, before his family, before any of this drama ever happened. It was early morning, early enough that the air was biting cold. It was the kind of pale, sharp winter cold that makes the morning light look incredibly clean and particular. I ran my usual loop around the lake, my breath pluming in the air. When I finished, I did not rush home. I sat down on a wooden bench facing the water for a few minutes to catch my breath. It is a thing I do sometimes now, simply because I am not in a desperate hurry to escape anywhere anymore. A golden retriever came jogging up to me, off its leash. It pushed its wet nose briefly against my knee, let me scratch its ears, and then happily trotted away after its owner. 2 young children near the swings were arguing loudly about whose turn it was, but they managed to resolve the conflict entirely on their own without any adults needing to intervene. As I sat there, the wind shifted. I smelled the bakery on the corner opening up for the day. I could smell the warm yeast of baking bread and the sharp cinnamon of something sweet drifting all the way into the park. It is the kind of wonderful smell that asks absolutely nothing from you, but gives you a moment of comfort anyway. I sat there on that cold bench for a long while. The apartment would still be there when I finally decided to walk back. It would be amber-lit. It would be perfectly quiet. It would be exactly as I left it. Nobody would be sitting inside it that I hadn't explicitly invited. The squeaky cabinet hinge was fixed. The dish rack was exactly where I liked to keep it. The cedar blocks were doing their job in the linen closet. The coastal painting was hanging at the exact height I had chosen with my own 2 hands. I stood up from the bench, stretched my legs, and started jogging back home. You know, some things in this life, you only truly understand how incredibly much they cost you once you finally get them back. My ordinary, boring life. The quiet street, the good afternoon light, the park, the smell of the bakery, the silent amber evenings. None of it had actually been ordinary at all. It had been a sanctuary I had built very carefully, brick by brick, over many years of hard work. And I had slowly given it away, piece by piece, boundary by boundary, under the tragic, misguided belief that being a good wife and showing true love required me to surrender my space. It does not. Love, the real kind of love, the absolute only kind worth keeping in this short life, does not ask you to change the fundamental thing that you are. True love works around the shape of your soul. It learns its way through the delicate space you occupy in the world without ever demanding you rearrange your bones to fit its convenience. I am learning, day by day, to occupy my own space again without offering a single apology for it. And I have to tell you, it is going incredibly well. I reached my building. I walked up the 3 flights of stairs. I did not feel tired. I pulled my key from my pocket. The door has my name on the lease. The lock answers only to my key. That is exactly where I am going to leave this story today, with that small, sufficient, entirely real fact. The door has my name on it, and I came home.